Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting at the Commonwealth Club of California. You can find the Commonwealth Club on the internet at commonwealthclub.org, see club videos on YouTube, and catch up with the club on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Megan Multeney, I'm a Wired science writer and your moderator for the program tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Catherine Ball, Chief Scientific Officer of Ancestry. You've seen the commercials and the TV series, Who Do You Think You Are? And you no doubt know that millions of people are now researching their family histories and identities. Today, Dr. Ball will reveal how DNA and family history data have fostered newly published research and have provided an unprecedented look at ancestral migration patterns, including 500 million genetic relationships, and ties these groups to historical events of the past 400 years. Dr. Ball says this data provides a more granular look at how immigration, geography, politics, religion, and economics have shaped the world. As Chief Scientific Officer at Ancestry, Dr. Ball spearheads the technology's initiatives to develop innovative data, new technologies, and analyze genetic information at a rapidly increasing scale. Dr. Ball has been a pioneer in data analysis resources for biomedical technologies. She led Stanford University genomic database, which was the largest of its kind and is a frequent contributor to National Institutes of Health committees. Throughout her career, Dr. Ball has used biomedical data to shed light on diverse research topics, from the biology of infectious diseases to mechanisms involved in cell division. She holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, prior to her research at Stanford University's Genetics and Biochemistry Department. Please welcome Dr. Ball.
Thank you.
So I want to get into all of that academic background at some point. But I cover science and biotechnology at Wired, and as a journalist who spends pretty much all my time trying to keep up with the advances in your field. I'm very excited to share the stage with you. We met for the first time over the phone, I think back in March? Yeah, yep. March, when your Nature Communications paper came out, which was discussed in the intro, and which we're going to spend a fair amount of time diving into. But first, we thought it might be appropriate to kind of start by covering the basics of exactly what it is you do when we talk about genetic sequencing and talk about genomic data. So if you're someone in the audience who submitted a spit sample to Ancestry, what do you do with it?
I try to do nothing with it. I hire people for that now. So what we do when you send in your spit sample is that we extract the DNA from it. Whether you know it or not, there are some human cells in your saliva, and each of your human cells has DNA, your DNA in it. We extract that DNA out of it, and then we examine your DNA at over around 700,000 different places all the way around your genome. And that gives us an opportunity to then do a bunch of different kinds of statistical analyses. So for example, we can find out where in the world your ancestors may have come from by comparing you to people living today in places all around the world. Or we can find out who in our database of over 4 million people you're related to. And we can find distant relatives, you can find brothers or sisters that you might not have known about, perhaps. We do. And then we can do meta-analysis of both this ethnicity estimate and who you're related to. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit in this publication that came out earlier this year.
Yeah, so you've been in the genomics field for close to 2 decades. How has the technology changed and advanced in the time that you've been working with it? How are the methods that you pay people to use to extract that information today different than it was when you started?
I can't even begin to start. Like when I first started as a young graduate student, it was much more difficult to do the kinds of experiments we did. We couldn't do them on the scale. The whole idea of surveying a whole genome of a human being, both quickly and inexpensively, was completely inconceivable. So we have made, in just the amount of time that I've been doing this, so many strides just in both the scope of what we can measure, the speed with which we can measure it, and the expense. It's so much less expensive now.
And what are the kinds of technologies that are driving those reductions in cost and making kind of an analysis at the scale in which we're going to talk about feasible?
So there are a bunch of different types of technologies that people use to do genomic science right now. The one you probably hear the most about in the news is whole genome sequencing, which has been extremely powerful, still pretty expensive. It's still thousands of dollars to sequence one person's genome, and it's still probably many thousands more to properly analyze it. Then there are other techniques that the one that we're using with Ancestry is something called a microarray, where it just really just samples across your genome inexpensively, just due to the ability of your DNA to stick to DNA that matches. We call that hybridization. Is one of the things I like most about DNA. It's got very simple biochemistry, makes it easy to do experiments.
So, when you were working at Stanford, you were there for close to 17 years, working with, all kinds of data, all kinds of genomes from yeast and bacteria, and helping scientists figure out how to find good vaccine targets for tuberculosis. What was it about Ancestry's data that made you leave such a premier program at an institution like Stanford?
It was the opportunity to do science at a scale. Even at Stanford, I was doing big scale experiments, but the idea of being able to do human genetics at this unprecedented scale was exciting. Being able to get DNA samples and get genotypes, that's what we call this assay, for millions of people was really inspiring. And the other part that was unique and still is unique to Ancestry is that people are working really hard to build their family trees. And so not only do they tell you who their relatives are, who their ancestors from long ago are, they also annotate their family trees with census records, birth certificates, sons and daughters of the American Revolution applications, just amazing, rich, deep data sources that a scientist like me looks at and says, I can do things that I've never been able to do anywhere else, any other time in my career, and yes, I will do that.
So, it seems like a good place to talk about how Ancestry wasn't always a DNA company. I think the kits only launched in 2012. So kind of what legacy is the DNA program at Ancestry building on in terms of the genealogical data that the company has been collecting for decades now?
It's a huge asset. When you're just starting a new business off, as we did with the DNA test, it was a huge relief and an asset to have dedicated customers who've been really working hard at their family trees and their genealogy, people that we could talk to and have them take the DNA test and react. One of the other things I love about Ancestry is that our customers are wildly engaged, and they tell us what they're thinking, whether we want to hear it or not. But we do want to hear it, the good stuff especially. And so they're really engaged, and they were terrific test bed customers for us. And they also recommended it to their friends and made it very powerful for new people who came in who don't have a family tree. If you have a relative who's been spending the last 20 years building her family tree, you just hit the jackpot, right?
I'm really curious about the way that adding genetic data to the mix kind of confronts people's notions about who they are and who their families were, and this, the stories they tell themselves about who they are and how they got there. Do any stories come to mind of your customers who kind of thought they had one thing with their family tree in front of them, and then the genetics showed a totally different picture of?
It happens all the time, I think, and I would say it happens really all the time, every single time. People we're all human, and we have the ability to be attracted to the stories about our family history that we want to be attracted to. And your genetics might not emphasize that story the same way you have in your imagination and in the storytelling from your grandparents. So, for example, just about every American family of any kind of long standing in the United States that has a Native American legend in their family. Like, show of hands, who's got, yeah, we don't. Right, so it was common in my family too, but it's the number one myth. Most people actually don't have it. It's part of the what we want to be true is something very interesting, and it tells something important about us. And then what the genetic evidence suggests really is true is also important and tells something different about us. And it's where the stories, what you want to be true about yourself, and what the evidence suggests, where those things meet, that's where the interesting part is for me.
Did you fill out a family tree prior to taking the job in Ancestry?
About 14 days before I started, yes, I did.
And when you went in and did kind of your own genetic exploration, what happened with when the place where those two data sets met?
I think I was a textbook case. I think one of the things that in my head, my mother's family were the people who really talked about our family history the most. And those were the stories that were the richer stories in my head. And sure enough, my genetics also reflects my father's family. Well, they don't really have the stories, but I just don't have the same mental history represented as I do the genetics, which makes sense. Like, my dad contributed half the genetics. He should have come up with more stories, but that's not his problem.
And was there one kind of relative in particular that you found out through the genetic analysis really kind of illuminated a part of your family history that you had been previously you hadn't been aware of?
Also on my dad's side of the family. My brothers here might be a surprise. So I have a great-great-grandmother who came from Norway. And like, I knew the family came from Norway, didn't necessarily know the names, but through the DNA testing, I found a cousin alive today who had been, I don't know, my cousin a couple times removed. But her great-great-grandfather was the brother of my great-great-grandmother, and she had some dirt. So, sure enough, my great-great-grandmother was an unwed mother, and in Norway, your last name is after your father. She emigrated from Norway with 3 children, 3 last names. So, and reinvented herself as a proper housewife in Wisconsin. But I would never have known this. This is the kind of story that you feel free to tell about, your aunties and uncles, but you're not going to tell your own kids that you were, run out of town by all the farmers' wives. But that's a story that was revealed to me only through the DNA testing, because I would have never found this distant cousin.
And I think that story really illustrates to me kind of, in a microcosm of what you were demonstrating in this paper in Nature Communications, which, combined the genetic data with the family tree data to kind of map how people moved around and married or procreated without marrying and around the US. And so I'm wondering if we can, dive into kind of why that seemed like the right question to really attack for the first time, because this was kind of the first publication, combining these like 2 big databases, that you guys came out with.
So I can step you back a little bit. So let's do a 30-second genetics 101. And we remember that we get half our DNA from our mom and half from our dad. Everybody remembers that part. And mom did the same thing, got half from grandma and half from grandpa. But all of us who have siblings will know this to be intuitively true, that we don't all get exactly the same half from mom or the same half from dad, right? We're all a little bit different from our siblings. And the same thing is true with our genetics. So we just get these random shuffled genomes of our grandparents every time we have another sibling. And so that gives you a lot of opportunities to sample the genomes of ancestors long gone. Like, the more relatives they have alive on this earth today, the more opportunity you have to figure out what was going on way back when. So in the paper that we are talking about, what we did is we took our whole database, at that time is about 1 million people, and we found out all the different related people in the database. So it's about 500 million different relationships in there, right? So if you think about all the ways that everybody in this room can be related, there's a lot of potential relationships. For 1 million people, there's even more. And what we could do is network analysis and find kind of clumps of people, like little hairballs that are more closely related to each other than they are to other people. That also kind of makes intuitive sense. You can see how that's going to happen around the world today. But what was really phenomenally exciting about being in Ancestry is that now we have these kind of groups of people who are more closely related to each other genetically. But what we can do is we can take their family trees and march up their family trees and find commonalities and find, for example, everybody in this little group of people have ancestors from Norway, or everybody from this little group of people have ancestors from Puerto Rico, or everybody in this group seems to have left England and moved to Utah to become Mormons, right? They all have these stories that you can pull out of the family trees. And just with this combination of genetics and family history, you can recapitulate all kinds of individual stories that led to us being who we are, where we are today.
And so that's, 500 million connections is, I don't think that any of us can even really picture what that looks like on a scale. So when you're thinking about pulling apart those relationships, how much of that is done by, say, computers, like mining for, different words or different connections between families versus, humans actually going through and pulling out kind of relevant historical context?
This is big data at its finest. Yes, it's no fun to go do this stuff by hand. So we do as much as we can using the computers. So we'll be looking for, all the connections are made with computers. Figuring out which groups are more closely connected to each other is done by computers. Finding commonalities in the family trees is done by computers. But making those stories is done by historians. So we did collaborate with a historian from Harvard who actually paid attention in history class instead of doing her math homework like I did. And so she could come up with, her and her colleagues would do this research, and she could find amazing stories. There's one little group of people who had ancestry in the 1800s. You could see them, people were living both in South Carolina and in Alabama. And they were closely related to each other, but one stayed over. And sure enough, she was able to find historical evidence of homesteads opening up in Alabama. And a whole group of people, wholesale, picked up and left their cousins behind in South Carolina and moved over Georgia. It was already fully settled, and settled in Alabama. So you can see these two groups of people who are still related to each other today in two non-adjoining states because land opened up 150 years ago. That's really cool. But only historians really going to be able to dig into it with that kind of attention to detail and context.
And so in the course of this study, how many distinct of these kinds of, balls or genetic communities were you able to kind of identify throughout the country? And did you see any kind of interesting patterns emerge for how, closely knit they were in different places versus other geographical locations?
So we saw in the end around 60 different populations within the United States. And one of the things that we noticed first, one of the first breakouts was definitely there's a skew between the North and the South. So as one of the first groups to break apart, is then you can see like politics has been affecting who people reproduce with for quite some time in our United States. If you see the North and the South, there you go. The other thing that you could see is that the South is a little bit more closely related to each other. Largely, if you look at history, the southern states did not get a lot of immigration. So they had a lot of settlers early on in the 1700s, and then their immigration was largely involuntary in the form of the slave trade after that.
And so what patterns do you see emerge over time? Like, I think today we think of, communities like that we largely choose our own communities. Like I, chose to move to San Francisco for a job, and, we don't stay rooted in the same place that we were born into. If you look at that temporal kind of scale, do you see kind of an acceleration of how far-flung people become from each other the kind of closer we get to the modern era?
You can definitely see within the data that we have, you can see the westward expansion as we move through time. You can also see people who live in major metropolitan areas, like California, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, tend to have cousins all over the country because we all moved from somewhere all over the country to these places, and then got tired of it and moved somewhere else, I guess. But you'll see cousins from all over the country. So there'll be differences. The other thing to think about is that younger people tend to be less confined to a single community. So anything that's a barrier to reproduction in humans is going to lead to what we call reproductive isolation. And so, to be perfectly honest, race in the United States has always been something that affects who your mate choice is, politics, and for the most part, geography, because reproduction works better that way. But but all those things have a religion, socioeconomic status, the language you speak, all these things affect who you're going to be related to. And we see all these different forces playing in the genetic communities that we can observe in the US today.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great lead-in for this question that we have from the audience. Thinking about beyond the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is obviously a nation of immigrants, and thinking about massive world-scale historical events that alter the course of migrations. The question for today is: can you speak about the challenge of ancestry, which halts due to World War I and II, annihilation of Jewish ancestors?
So with any kind of population where there's like a giant disruption, either in like people not being there anymore or in the records being lost, you're going to see disruptions in both the individual's family history, the way you would think about it yourself because you've lost a bunch of uncles and aunts and grandparents, but also in the way that you're going to be able to extend through that genetic network and find other people alive today. So that would be one of those things that absolutely genocide works. So you are going to remove people from the genetic sampling that you can find.
And that kind of just brought to mind, I'm curious how do you see any evidence of bias for, groups that are more likely to engage in genealogy than others? So in terms of thinking of, who are the populations who are, most excited about tracking down all their relatives, who you have in your database, how does that affect kind of the representativeness you kind of see of those genetic populations?
So our database is not a good global picture of the world. It's a pretty decent snapshot of the demographics we observe in the United States. I think we probably skew a little bit older. It's probably skew a little bit whiter because these are people who can have a lot more satisfaction of searching other people's family trees. And we probably skew more toward people who are not recent immigrants, again, because you have more success with the family trees. But with a DNA test, we're seeing a lot more people who are not quite so genealogically oriented, but just curiosity driven, taking the test. They just want to find out more about themselves without having to embark on a big giant research project, which is fun, it's exciting.
Yeah, are you seeing any, if you think about how many people a week are submitting their spit samples to Ancestry, was it largely kind of the genealogical subscribers at the beginning, and now it's expanded to people who are perhaps not already in the Ancestry database in some form?
Absolutely. When we first started, we allowed only people who are already part of the genealogical database to start working, largely because they'd be kind to us. They're easy for us to market to, and they provide a really valuable test bed, because if you take a DNA test early on with the hopes of finding out something about your family tree or your family history, you'd be a lot happier if you had several cousins who already had something interesting to say. But now we have a pretty significant proportion of our customers who are new to genealogy, new to family history, and maybe just really curious about what their DNA says about them today, rather than being students of the past.
Well, I think that's, one question that I had about, the relevance of the data that you compiled for the Nature Communications paper, beyond just seeing these kind of cool threads that extend back through history. What impacts does it have for, say, researchers looking to, develop treatments for various diseases, that it matters what your genetic background is in terms of whether or not you'll be perceptive to that treatment?
So hopefully this room knows, and if you don't, you should, that your genetic background can definitely inform whether or not you're going to respond to particular treatment. There are some drugs that won't work as well if you are European, some won't work as well as if you're Asian, so these things actually do matter. And we're only really able, and by we, I'm talking about the global group of genomics researchers in the world, we're not able to have this very fine-tuned breakdown of the world's genetics because we just don't have that much data yet.
What would be enough data? Just because, I mean, it seems like a lot of data to those of us who are not big data scientists. So what would be enough?
I'm liking my 4 million right now. I'm pretty comfortable. But always more is better. Like, the more you're able to break something down, the more fine-tuned you'll be able to get. So, an example would be, asthma medicine. There are definitely some children who do not respond well, and it turns out that some of them are Hispanic. And if you can sort of tease some of that out, you can find out more and get a genetic test early on and be able to treat a child with asthma much more effectively if you know whether or not they have a particular genetic background that's going to interfere with their processing of that drug.
And so just, maybe to clarify for the audience, because there are, obviously you're not the only DNA testing outfit kind of on the market. How does Ancestry differentiate from some of the other companies in this space who are more specifically focused on health and looking at genetic data to inform people's health decisions?
I think one of the things that differentiates us, first of all, is that we haven't been in the field very long. We launched the test a mere 5 years ago, and we're already the leader in the field. And so the premise that people are actually highly motivated and interested in family history has been proven. So that's what we're about. We're about connectedness. We're about telling people who they are, and we're working really hard at scale. We do think that the bigger our collection of both genetic samples and these family trees that allow us to understand what the heck is going on will give us much more power, no matter what application, whether it's just in family history or in lifestyle factors, drug response, or other health things. No matter what, bigger is better. We're emphasizing growth of the database.
Well, there's a question from the audience that is relevant to that statement, and it was, what is the outlook for Ancestry over the next 10 years?
Well,
in particular, general consumer genetic products.
So I think over the next 10 years, no matter what, we're going to see a lot of growth in the consumer genomics world. I think we and other competitors have definitely proven that there's a lot of interest in it, and I'm hoping to see great things for the whole field. I think for Ancestry, as I said before, we want to reach out to as many people in the United States and the rest of the world as possible, because I think that's where the power is. Having a big database and having a lot of those connections that we can do some math with.
So one thing just to kind of mix or kind of like change directions for a second, I was really taken by this ad that I saw of Ancestry.com over the 4th of July weekend, and it was before I knew that we were going to do this talk, and I don't actually watch TV very much, so it was, I feel like total happenstance that I came upon it. But for those of you who didn't see it, it was this kind of very provocative, patriotic ad that begins with a number of different voices kind of reciting the first few lines of the Declaration of Independence. And as that's happening, this group of men and women of, her black and white and all different races are kind of assembling in this room that is like vaguely recognizable from US history textbooks. It turns out it's Declaration Hall. And by the end, you realize that they have recreated John Turnbull's kind of famous painting that kind of captured the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then at the end, you realize that it's an Ancestry ad, and that in fact all of those people are direct descendants of signers of the Declaration of Independence. And it was about unlocking your past and imagining your future, or I might have that backward. But I wanted to talk about both, so I know that those, you found those people because they have they have their own registry, but what was it like to validate the fact that those people, who had this idea about themselves were in fact the people that they thought they were, and then, to have them be a part of, to be able to kind of recreate that for the broader audience to kind of see exactly what that history meant to them.
So for clarification, everybody who took part in this recreation was a descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Not every single one of them had children, so we had to fill those guys in with other descendants. But they had registered to be part of society, so they'd had to go and prove the paper trail themselves. Genealogists from Ancestry went and verified those connections for every single person who participated in the reenactment. And it was very interesting, though. I think the whole company had been very proud of that ad. It was, you're right, more than a little provocative. Women were allowed to be in the recreation. The people of all kinds of different ethnicities were in the recreation. There's even a child in there as well. So just when you think about the legacy of all those people who are really putting their lives, their reputations, their pretty significant fortunes, because they're all rich guys, on the line that day to sign the Declaration of Independence without any idea what their legacy would be. For me, it was astonishing to see how diverse and impressive and unpredictable their legacy would be, and putting myself in those shoes, like, what will my legacy be? I can't even begin to imagine. So that's what I was hoping people brought out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a very kind of salient reminder that the present moment that we think of as being like entirely ours and on its own is actually just one part of a long thread stretching, back hundreds of years. And I think as people today continue to struggle to define themselves, whether through their political identities or their online communities or their chosen families, it seems increasingly that genetics has some role to play in helping people figure out who they are. And I'm curious what, based on the fact that Ancestry was willing to kind of run an ad like that on 4th of July, what does the company think, how does the company think genetics can inform the conversations that we're having about diversity in America and kind of identity politics at this present moment?
I think I will not speak for the company here. I'll speak for myself. I would say personally what I would hope people would learn from genetics is that we are all so much more alike than we are different. We are so much more related than we're not. And in a room this size, I can guarantee you there are at least one set of fourth cousins. Guaranteed, right? So look around. So that's important. So we're not only are we special, unique little snowflakes defined by our genetics that have never been seen before anywhere else, unless you've got an identical twin, in which case yours is still better, right? But we're connected, and we have so much more in common with each other. So that's where I look at that. We're working really hard to separate ourselves from others based on our careers or our religions or our the parts of our family history we would like to put forward, and not the ones we want to forget. But instead, we have so much more in common. We really are far more related to each other. The reason why we're here has to do with wars and famines and droughts and political issues and the opening up of homesteads somewhere, and so much less to do really with the ego and the individuals at play. So we live in a river of history. It's not just that history ends up here where I am, but it's going to continue. And it is a continuum, right? There are these threads that lead to us now, but they're the threads of the rest of history, taking our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our nieces and nephews along for the ride. And we owe it to them to be a little more thoughtful about what we're giving them.
Do you think that how soon until all of our descendants will just have their genes sequenced on birth? Is that where we're headed?
I think so, absolutely. And I think there are a couple of different things that we have to solve first. The first is that we have to, number one, make it not so expensive both to sequence a whole genome and to store it and do all those things we need to do with it. And the other thing that we need to, and we, again, being the giant community of genomic researchers, is we have to make it worth people's while. We have to work on the value of that genome sequence. Right now, I'll be the first to admit that as soon as I had the chance to get my genome fully sequenced, I jumped. Of course I did it, right? And I don't have much to say. Like I can pass on a couple of mutations that might be really bad if one of my kids had both of them, but they didn't, and everything's fine. I'm a carrier. But I don't have much that's actionable. And that's true for most people right now. A whole genome sequence is going to tell you very much if you're a healthy adult. But we have to work on that. As a community, I think there's a lot of value that we just have not tapped into.
Well, I think there are, at least from some of the questions that we have received, there are, I think, people who are a little bit skeptical about jumping into whole genome sequencing. And so I'm going to kind of summarize them because there are a few that are along the same lines. But generally, how does Ancestry keep the data it collects secure? How do people know when this is a couple questions from the audience. How do people know when they spit in a tube and they give you all their genetic information and sign a thing that says that you can have it and use it in perpetuity, that it will be safe in perpetuity?
That's a good question, and it's an important question. There's absolutely nothing more private to you or more personal to you than your genetics. So it is important that we treat this with the respect and privacy that it deserves. To start out with, Ancestry does not assert any ownership over your genetics, either your spit sample, which is all yours, or the data that come out of it. And if we just see ourselves as stewards, and we only do that which our customers have consented to allow us to do. And so that mindset from the very start informs everything that goes downstream. So we do make sure that we separate your biological sample from any kind of personally identifiable information. Your name and your saliva sample don't meet each other. We have all the normal, computer security methods to keep hackers out to the best of our abilities. But one of the primary principles we have is just really trying to keep the genetic information away from the personally identifiable information, even within the company.
And so how does consent work? Is it on it so for all the people who consented for the paper that became the Nature Technology or Nature Communication study, do they consent, to that research paper and then another research paper down the line, or is it kind of a blanket consent that once they've said they are fine with their genetic data being used for research, it can be for
So when you take the DNA test, the first thing you have to do is accept the terms and conditions, meaning that I am going to, some guy I hire is going to take the DNA out of your saliva and subject it to genotyping, and we're going to analyze it. We're going to give you the results. And everybody who accepts those terms and conditions gets that product. There's an optional consent into research that's been reviewed by an institutional review board to make sure we're not doing anything untoward and being fair to the participants. People either opt in or opt out, and it covers anonymized research, that either data that we might share with a researcher at Stanford or Berkeley or something like that, or even within our own group that we publish for other people to use. And that's anonymized. People have to consent into it. And if they withdraw their consent, then they're not part of any future research project.
So they can withdraw consent at any time.
These data are yours, and you can decide what happens to them.
And so this is another kind of variant on that question from the audience. Because they have someone who's done both the genetic testing as well as the family history, kind of where do those live in separate places? And if so, kind of who has access to that information, one or both?
Yes, they do live in different places. They are even sort of tended to by different teams. The people who have access to both are very few and far between. They're usually going to be the people who are trying to help a customer solve problems, or going to be a small number of scientists who work for me. They'll get your de-identified tree, but maybe know your great-great-grandfather's last name and where he was born, for example.
Got it. And so are samples stored for, because I know one part of the terms and conditions says, to be analyzed by techniques or technologies not yet developed or discovered. And I had the same question as whoever this was in the audience. So samples, unless you ask to have them back, are they stored to be used by, genetic techniques that we don't yet know about?
Well, I haven't used any genetic techniques I don't know about yet. But for example, one of a big driver for a lot of our customers is to get an ethnicity estimate. And so when we find people or groups of people or samples in the database that might come from an interesting, ethnic group or something like that, what we're able to do is maybe have their genome assayed in a little more detail. We still don't know who they are because they're anonymized, but one of the things we'd like to do, and to be perfectly honest, the whole genomics field does have a bit of a bias. We've definitely assayed far more people of European ancestry than people who are not. So getting more data about non-Europeans, not only does it fuel a much better customer experience down the line and allow us to do a lot of improvements, it also sheds new light that we wouldn't able to find otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And so this is actually a really interesting question. So there's a question from the audience that says, Ancestry DNA has a massive database. However, access to DNA data is very limited for developers. Are there any plans to add an open-facing API to allow individuals convenient access to their data? I imagine that might have some security repercussions as well.
That would have some security repercussions. And I'm not talking about future plans. From a scientific point of view, yes, I agree. It's fun to have access to giant databases of genetic information. Again, we're stewards of this data. They're not our data to share. They're yours. They're yours.
I'm just going to keep digging into these questions because you guys have anticipated all my follow-ups.
Nicely done.
Regarding kind of third parties, what are the how can people be assured that, that their data is not going to get sold to, say, an insurance company and that might come back to them in some form or fashion? I feel like that's a relevant concern given the current healthcare discussion.
I think that is a concern. Again, we do not assert any ownership over your data. We're stewards of those data. When we have your consent to do so, we will share de-identified, anonymized, your name's not on it, data with a third party to either publish interesting conclusions for the rest of the scientific community or to do research of their own. So again, it's not our data. We don't get to sell it.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can talk about one kind of research partnership that has been made public, your work collaborating with Calico, who's doing work on longevity research and how people's genetics can determine, or maybe not determine, to be determined, how long you live or why some people live longer than others. Can you tell us a little bit about how that collaboration works?
I can tell you a little bit about it. I don't want to steal their thunder. It's their science. Calico, for those of you who don't know, is one of Google's alphabet companies. They are a biotech company whose hope is to kind of find ways to extend human longevity and both allow us to live longer but healthier lives, which I'm behind. Every day I get a little bit more behind it too. So. And so we have been able to share both the genealogical data and some of the de-identified genetic data. Both the genealogical data and the genetic data have been completely de-identified, so the no names are associated with them. But what they're able to do is use statistics and computational methods to see if they can find heritable gene or marker for longevity. And so that is the goal, to see if there is indeed or not evidence that your genetics determines how long you live.
And is there any ability for people contributing genetic data to Ancestry's database to say, you know, I'd like my DNA to be used to investigate longevity, but maybe not diabetes? I don't know why you would do that, but but to be able to pick and choose, you know, knowing, is there any kind of portal to kind of understand the research partnerships that you have in place? And
we do have a portal to explain what research projects are going on. We don't at this point support the opting in and out and picking and choosing of a multiple choice. I think that is an interesting model, and I think a lot of people are a little bit more motivated for something that is meaningful to them and their family to support that research. But at this point, we don't support that.
Okay. And so one question, a few questions that came up was, how does time impact your ability to be sure about a judgment about someone's ancestry? So like, the further back, does it get harder the further back you go in generations, or like, what is the kind of durability of that genetic signal? And how do you employ historians on staff to kind of help validate some of those genetic signals in terms of like real world populations?
So I'll answer the second question first, because that's the easy one.
Perfect.
Yes. We like to help from historians to help us with, again, the stuff that we didn't pay attention to because some of us were too busy doing math, because that's what we're trying to sell. We're trying to convey to our consumers these rich and exciting stories that the math and the statistics are telling. So we need to partner with historians because they're the ones who know the right stories to tell, right? And as far as like the length of time goes, remember we were talking about getting half your DNA from mom and half your DNA from dad. At some point, you know, as you move further on, yes, mom got half hers from grandpa and half from grandma, but you probably got a little more from grandma than you did from grandpa sometimes, and that's going to be true every single generation. So at some point, you can think about it, and again, if you think about your siblings, it does make a little bit more sense. They're going to be ancestors from long, long ago that you might have a little chunk of DNA from that your brother or sister might not, right? So as time goes on, you will not have a piece of DNA inherited from every single one of your cajillion ancestors, but a subsampling. And that does make sense, so that signal does decay with time because that's what happened in your genome. And your story will be different from your sibling's story, which will be different from your cousin's story as well.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted just a couple questions that were all the same, just in trying to understand the National Geographic DNA project versus Ancestry. So maybe that would be a good opportunity to talk about the product kind of currently on the market, and like help people understand if that's the only product that Ancestry uses in terms of DNA analysis kits, or if there are other ones as well.
So there are a lot of different consumer genomics tests out there on the market. Most of them at this point use a very similar biochemistry, slightly different, but similar type of biochemistry we call a microarray, that again does a survey all the way across your genome of individual markers all the way across. And then the art that's different for every different organization that's selling one of these products, or even for university research projects that's using these data, the art is in the statistics. The art's in the software, the algorithms, the comparisons that you do to provide insight. And it will all be different because it'll be written by different scientists. They have different data going in. They have very different targets. At Ancestry, our target's really telling you about your connectedness to people living today, and as much as we can about your pretty recent ancestors. And by recent ancestors, I'm a scientist, I mean, within the last several hundred years, as opposed to your ancestors from thousands of years ago.
So is there any utility in, or, getting my DNA sequence with Ancestry and doing it 23andMe and doing it with Helix and doing it with color and then kind of combining all those? Like, can I, as a normal human, like, understand what the differences would be, like, looking at that? Or would I need to be a geneticist to have any value?
Well, I posit that geneticists are also normal human beings. So I do think that there are a lot of people who are aficionados and have actually taken the time to really understand the subtle differences that all kinds of different tests provide. And if you're one of those people, I say, go for it. This is a new and emerging business, and the whole field has a lot of really interesting things to offer, and it's going to be evolving and changing rapidly. Every business, every resource is really spending a lot of assets trying to improve their estimates, make things more interesting, refine things, expand things. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be an adventure for the next few years.
And is there any utility in waiting until the costs come down?
Absolutely not. Do it now. Time's a wasting.
This is a question from the audience about what are Ancestry's plans to increase diversity, non-European, of their genetic samples?
Again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about plans, but it is one of the things that's been pretty important to me personally and to the whole team that I lead. One of the first things that we did when we kicked off the Ancestry DNA product, and before the product was available to the market, we purchased a collection of genetic samples from around the world. And that was one of our first investments, was actually in increasing the diversity of our reference samples. It included hundreds of samples collected from people living today all over West Africa, which has enabled us to have a much more powerful, basically ethnicity estimate for African Americans than anybody else, because we went after that. Diversity is important to us.
And how do you estimate, say like a specific country like Norway versus a specific region like Scandinavia? Like, how do you get down to that more granular level when countries have, kind of, moving boundaries?
Yeah. I will say it is difficult. And one of the things that is always an adventure for a geneticist trying to communicate her results to a consumer is that, well, as a geneticist, we think about populations. We don't think about countries. We think about populations that tend to be closely related to each other and don't have a lot of back and forth. But those populations, people move, right? And so people do invade other countries and leave some DNA behind and take some prisoners with them, and that does add to some noise in your genetic signal. And also, many of those countries that we think of as, my family came from Germany. Well, actually, the concept of Germany is a relatively recent one, right? And so putting your family history in the context of what was really happening hundreds of years ago and still talking to a consumer today is a real challenge. It's one that I embrace. I like it, but it is hard. And the more closely related to populations are, like, Norway and Sweden would be two examples of populations that have been mingling a little bit from time to time and sharing their signals with others. Those are two that are more challenging to differentiate than two populations on either side of the Sahara Desert, for example.
So can you talk a little bit about the statistics involved in, having these kinds of confident estimates of what ethnicities people's results return to them?
So we put a lot of effort in trying to help people understand our confidence in an assignment. So especially when you're trying to break things into what we call subcontinental population assignment, when we give you your ethnicity estimate saying you're Norwegian or Scandinavian. there's going to be a lot of error, largely because that's a pretty precise assignment we're making. So one of the things that we do to try to capture how much error is going to be in there is we'll take out about 10% of your data and recalculate your ethnicity estimate. And then we put it back in and take a different 10% out and recalculate your estimate. And we do that 40 times. And so that'll give you a distribution. Most of the time, those estimates will be exactly dead set in the middle. But every now and then, if you take 10% of your data out, you're going to get a noisy estimate at one end that might be much higher or much lower. So it sort of captures all the potential possibilities. And we try to be as transparent about that as possible because people are trying to figure out where they're from. And you need to be transparent about that. If you're possibly 75% Norwegian or 100% Norwegian, those things make a difference.
And how do you notice any trends in when, you said you have a very engaged kind of population, and people want to talk about their results. Have you seen any patterns or trends where people, have an ethnicity show up more often that they didn't expect?
I'm not sure I've seen people popping up with ethnicities they didn't expect. Again, I do think there are a lot of stories of people who are finding ethnicities, especially their Native American ethnicity, not showing up. That's a disappointment and a surprise. But I can't think off the top of my head. I think almost everybody has a little bit of a surprise somewhere. And I think a lot of it would probably be more often than not in some of those populations that are complicated. So, people from the British Isles may have a lot of heritage also from Scandinavia or Ireland due to just the proximity and invasions and migrations, voluntary or otherwise, to and from. And so that's actually not really, I think, an unexpected result so much as it's capturing a wealth of information that you didn't factor in when you thought about my family's from Scotland. You don't factor in the fact that Scotland's been invaded several times by various Vikings.
I think on that note, I think we're going to take the last question from the audience, which is, to the best of your recollection, what is the highest percentage of Neanderthal you've ever seen in an individual?
Well, my brother's here, so. Yeah, I will pay for that. I'll pass on that one. There's nobody who wants to reveal that one.
Fair enough. Well, so I think with our remaining time, at Wired, we cover kind of things that are currently happening in science and technology, but we always have an eye towards the future and hopefully an optimistic future, at least where we can find one. And so I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts on the promise of wide-scale genetics information, like at the scale of 4 million. What will that kind of enable scientists such as yourself to really, what kind of questions will that allow you to ask that are really kind of beyond your grasp at the present moment?
Again, I think I'm going to answer this as a scientist, right? The promise that we all made when we embarked on the Human Genome Project is that we were going to make lives better for people all over the world. And I think we have made baby steps, right? So yes, there's a lot to be done in the world of finding out what kind of health risks a person should be addressing in his or her life. Yes, there's a lot to be learned about what you may be passing on to your children. Yes, there's a lot to be learned about what drugs you might respond to better than others. Yes, there's probably a lot to learn about what kind of, lifestyle and fitness and wellness routines might be better for you than for others. Although I posit any kind of exercise is better than none. But I think also the other promise that we are starting to scratch the surface on is the connectedness, is finding out this tension between myself as a unique individual as opposed to the way I'm connected to so many millions of other people on the world, on the earth today. Right? That connectedness, that the way that I'm related to people I've never ever met is important, and is being able to like tell something about not only distant human evolution, but our history and all those different choices and all those different historical events that led to you being related to a bunch of other people is pretty important. I think one of the things that we think of ourselves as far more autonomous, free agents than history suggests we really are. I think we are subject to pressures of the culture around us. We are subject to the history of the nations where we live. We are subject to famines and droughts that the climate inflicts upon us. And those things have shown up in our genetics today, and I see no reason to expect that's going to stop anytime soon. So that's part of that promise, be able to see the history written in our genes.
Well, I think since you kind of brought up the Human Genome Project, right away, I certainly at Wired, and I think at other places, we're thinking about the promise of genetics in terms of curing human disease, if that even is an achievable dream. But I'm curious if you think that at Ancestry, given that you have this incredible database in which you can make more powerful insights than arguably anyone else in the country, do you have a responsibility to devote that data to questions of medical science?
Again, the data are not mine, unfortunately. The data belong to the consumers, and so our responsibility does lie to our customers, and I think we do deliver what they've asked us to deliver. And the market speaks. They want to know more about their origins, their family history, and about themselves as people. And that's what I'm really focusing on right now, just absolutely executing on that promise. Tell you about yourself, your connectedness to others, and your family history, and that doing the very best we can with that.
Well, I know we can't speak too much about the future, so I appreciate you speculating at least a little bit. And then, I think one other question that I think we all who are thinking about, what it means to understand ourselves kind of on a genetic level in this day and age is, how to protect that information and kind of the, and not just the information itself, but kind of what it means and what it means for our legacy and our children and our great-grandchildren. So maybe just with the final moments, I'd be curious if you could talk about how Ancestry thinks about just, you've asked, people have asked for you to tell them who they are, and you've done that. And so once you've entered into that relationship where kind of you are the safeguards of their data, what commitments have you made to keep that data safe for the future and kind of for the all of the descendants that might come after?
I think that's a pretty significant question. I think one of the things that we as an organization are committed to. This is a very nascent field, and so I can't say that we're walking down a well-trod path. We're having to blaze the trail. We're doing it very respectfully, and we do want to engage in conversations with just regular people, with governmental agencies, with researchers and scientists around the world about what is the right thing to do with respect to genetic data, both now and in the future as we archive it. What are reasonable protections? What are reasonable expectations about how to store and use these data? I think they've been well protected by our organization for sure, but I think we do want to kick off a conversation, and we do have a responsibility to do so as the leaders in the field. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, with that, we are at time. So our thanks to Catherine Ball, Chief Scientific Officer at Ancestry. And we also thank the audiences here and on the radio and television and maybe even later the internet. I'm Megan Multeney, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you are in the know, is adjourned.